Have you ever stopped to think about how the lines we see on a map, they aren't always so clear-cut?
Right. Yeah.
We're about to take a deep dive into the intricate history of the U.S. and Central America, and this idea of a myth of the border that's going to be our guide. We're talking decades of interconnected events, policies, all of it drawn from these really personal stories in this book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here.
What's interesting about the book is how it manages to blend historical analysis with very personal stories of the people who actually lived through these times.
Yeah, that's what drew me to it. So we're not just talking policy here, but we're really seeing how those policies had a real impact on people.
Absolutely.
We're going to meet people like Juan. He was a doctor in El Salvador, and he faced death squads. I mean, talk about putting your life on the line.
Yeah.
Then there's Eddie. He's a teenager caught between gang life in LA and El Salvador. Tough situation. And Keldy, she's trying to navigate the U.S. asylum system. Their stories are each unique, but they're all woven together in a way that really shows how complicated the relationship is between the U.S. and Central America.
One thing that you'll see popping up again and again as we go through all this is the ripple effect.
What do you mean?
Well, the decisions made in Washington, D.C., they have consequences.
Yeah.
And those consequences are felt in the lives of people in Central America.
Makes sense.
But it goes both ways. What happens in Central America also affects the U.S. Take the 1970s and 80s, for example. You've got the Cold War in full swing.
Right.
And Central America kind of became this battleground for these proxy conflicts.
Yeah, and U.S. foreign policy during that time, it was a real balancing act. On one hand, you have this commitment to stopping the spread of communism.
Right.
But on the other hand, that sometimes meant turning a blind eye to some pretty awful stuff.
You're right. It was a time of some really tough choices. The Carter administration, they came in really wanting to prioritize human rights.
Yeah.
But then under Reagan, that focus shifted back to those Cold War fears.
Back to kind of containing communism, yeah.
Exactly. And this is really important to understand what was happening in El Salvador back then.
Which brings us back to Juan, the doctor. I mean, think about it. He wasn't just a doctor. He was actually a target.
How?
He was tortured by death squads, which is just awful. It's a really stark reminder of how brutal the civil war in El Salvador was.
It's hard to imagine.
He did manage to escape eventually, but his story, it really shows the human cost of the decisions that the U.S. was making about foreign policy back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's during this whole chaotic time that we see the sanctuary movement emerge.
The what, sorry?
The sanctuary movement. Think about this. You have everyday Americans who are so moved by what's happening, so compelled to help, they decided to take a stand. They're risking everything to shelter Central Americans who are fleeing this violence.
Wow.
Risking their own freedom, really.
That's incredible. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Right.
So they weren't like big organizations or anything.
Not at first. It was really a grassroots thing. People driven by compassion, a sense of, we got to do something.
Wow. Were they ever scared of getting caught?
Of course, yeah. They were putting themselves in real danger. Legally, everything. But they weren't deterred. They even created this really clever system using bus tickets to communicate.
What? How did that work?
So a red ticket meant it was safe to go to a safe house in the U.S., a haven.
Okay.
But a blue ticket, that meant they needed to head to Canada to seek refuge.
Wow, that's incredible. They really had to think on their feet.
It really was remarkable. This network, operating almost underground, smuggling information, people, always one step ahead of the authorities.
Like something out of a movie.
Right.
But this wasn't just about outsmarting the system. It was about something much bigger.
Absolutely.
It was about giving hope to people who had been through absolute hell. And get this, Juan, after he escaped, he became a leader in this movement.
Oh, wow. What a story.
Right. Talk about coming full circle.
Yeah. I mean, Juan's whole journey, it really shows how these events, they go way beyond borders. It's not just about what happens in El Salvador or the U.S. It's all connected. His story starts in El Salvador, then it intersects with U.S. foreign policy, and then he ends up being the symbol of hope for other people who are seeking refuge in the U.S. It's like this blurring of lines, and that's really at the heart of this myth of the border idea.
Yeah, it shows how these issues, they don't just stay in one place or one time period, right?
Yeah.
They have this ripple effect across generations, across continents. And then as we get into the 1990s, we see a whole other set of issues popping up. The Cold War is ending, but Central America is still dealing with what happened because of those proxy conflicts.
Right.
So you have these civil wars ending, but then gang violence is getting worse.
Exactly. And that's where Eddie's story comes in. He's kind of caught in the middle of all this.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, he's the child of Salvadoran immigrants, goes up in Los Angeles, gets caught up in gang life. Then he gets deported back to El Salvador, a place he barely knows. And he's thrown into this society that's still trying to recover from its own problems.
That's rough. So he's running from gang violence in the U.S. and ends up right back in the middle of it in El Salvador.
It's a vicious cycle, almost like history repeating itself. And this is where that myth of the border idea becomes even more clear. You see the U.S. trying to deal with its own gang problems, so what do? They start deporting people on a massive scale.
And I'm guessing that didn't really solve anything?
Not really. The intention might have been good, make the U.S. safer. But what they didn't realize, or maybe they just didn't care, was that they were basically sending the problem somewhere else.
So instead of fixing it, they just made it worse for someone else.
Exactly. And a lot of these deportees, young men like Eddie, they didn't have a lot of options back in their home countries. They didn't have support systems, they were struggling to find jobs, and they were vulnerable to being pulled right back into the same criminal activities they were trying to escape.
That's heartbreaking. It's like they were set up to fail.
In a way, they were. And this wave of deportees, many of whom were involved in gangs, it really fueled the growth of gangs like MS-13 in Central America.
So they were trying to get away from gangs and ended up making the problem worse somewhere else.
Exactly. It's tragic, but it's the reality.
Yeah.
And Eddie's stuck right in the middle of it.
His story is so sad. It's like he never really had a chance to just be a kid, either in the U.S. or in El Salvador. But there is a little bit of hope in his story, right?
Yes, definitely. He eventually manages to escape that gang life. He comes back to the U.S., and he starts over. He gets a job at an animal hospital.
That's great to hear. It shows that people can change even when they've been through so much.
Absolutely. It really highlights how important it is to have support systems to help people who are trying to turn their lives around.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder about all the other Eddies out there, the ones who don't get that second chance.
That's a good point. It makes you think about what could have been for those who weren't as lucky. And that brings up a bigger question. What was being done back then to address these complex immigration problems? Was there any effort to reform the system?
Yeah, there were definitely some attempts at reforming U.S. immigration policy during the 1990s and 2000s, but it was and still is a really sensitive topic politically. So you end up with this tangled web of laws and programs with varying degrees of success.
Right. It seems like every administration has a different approach. And we meet two really important figures during this time, Doris Meissner and Cecilia Munoz. Both of them were in positions of power within the U.S. government, and they were both trying to tackle these very issues.
That's right. Meissner was given the huge job of overhauling the asylum system at a time when there was a lot of negativity towards immigrants.
That sounds like a really tough job. What were some of the biggest challenges she faced?
Well, the system was completely overwhelmed. There were huge backlogs, cases were taking forever, and frankly, it often felt like the system was designed to keep people out rather than help them.
So she was basically handed a broken system and told to fix it. How did she even begin to approach that?
She was very practical about it. She knew that the system had to be humane, but it also had to be efficient. But of course, she had to deal with the political realities of the time as well.
It sounds like she was walking a tightrope. And then you have Cecilia Munoz working under the Obama administration. She was pushing for more humane policies, but it sounds like she faced opposition even from people within her own administration.
That's right. Munoz was a strong advocate for immigrants. She believed that there had to be a way to enforce immigration laws while also treating immigrant communities fairly. But the Obama administration was dealing with a lot of baggage from previous policies, economic anxieties, and a Congress that couldn't agree on anything. It made comprehensive immigration reform incredibly difficult.
It always seems like there are so many competing priorities when it comes to immigration. It's never just about one thing.
Exactly. And it's against this backdrop that we meet Kelly. Her experience really brings all of these policy debates into focus because she's living it.
Right. She's not just reading about it in a textbook.
Exactly. She's a Honduran woman, and she's facing this incredibly daunting task of navigating the U.S. asylum system while she's also desperate to reunite with her family.
It's easy to forget about the human side of these issues when you're caught up in all the policy details. But Keldy's story is a powerful reminder that these aren't just abstract ideas. They have very real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. Her struggle to understand the asylum process, the constant fear of being deported, the pain of being separated from her loved ones, it really highlights the human cost of these policy decisions. And it was during this time that programs like Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, and the Secure Communities Program were implemented. Both of these programs were intended to address specific immigration concerns, but they also came with their own set of challenges and unintended consequences.
To be honest, I'm not totally clear on how those programs worked. Could you explain them a bit more and what made them so complicated?
Sure. So TPS is a program that offers temporary legal status to people from countries that are considered too dangerous for them to return to. This could be because of war, natural disasters, or other extreme situations.
So it's kind of like a safety net for people who can't go home.
Exactly. It allows them to live and work legally in the U.S. and contribute to society. But here's the thing. TPS doesn't lead to permanent residency. It's temporary, and it depends on whether or not the situation in their home country improves.
So it must be incredibly stressful for people who are living under TPS. They're always worried about what will happen if their TPS expires.
Absolutely. They're in limbo. And then you have the Secure Communities Program. This program was originally designed to identify and deport undocumented immigrants who had committed serious crimes.
So the focus was on public safety, going after people who posed a real danger to others.
That was the idea. But in reality, Secure Communities ended up catching a lot of undocumented immigrants who had committed minor offenses or in some cases no crimes at all.
I can see how that would create a sense of fear and mistrust of law enforcement within immigrant communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
People were afraid to report crimes because they were worried about being deported even if they hadn't done anything seriously wrong.
So even though the intention behind the program might have been good, it had some really negative consequences.
Exactly. And these examples just go to show that even when policymakers have the best intentions, their decisions can have unintended consequences that reach far beyond what they imagine.
And that takes us right back to the idea of the myth of the border. What happens in Washington, D.C. when they make decisions about immigration and foreign policy, it has a ripple effect that reaches all the way to Central America. And those decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're connected to history, geopolitics, and the personal stories of countless individuals like Juan Eddy and Keldy. And this whole web of cause and effect continues to evolve as we move into the 2010s. And then we get to the 2010s. Things are changing in the U.S. politically. And immigration, which is already a really big deal, it becomes even more so. People are really divided about it.
You're right. The Trump administration's approach to immigration was a big shift from what we'd seen before. Stephen Miller was a major force behind it, and the administration put a lot of policies in place that aimed to really limit immigration, both legal and illegal, especially from Central America.
Yeah, there were a lot of big changes. Weren't there travel bans on people from certain countries? And then there was that Remain in Mexico policy that caused so much controversy. And of course, the family separation policy, which people were really upset about, both here and in other countries.
Yeah, those policies were presented as a way to make the border more secure and discourage illegal immigration, but they really affected a lot of people.
Yeah.
The Remain in Mexico policy, which was officially called the Migrant Protection Protocols, made asylum seekers stay in dangerous places in Mexico while they waited for their cases to be heard in U.S. courts. It was a terrible situation. They were vulnerable to all kinds of dangers, violence, exploitation, even extortion.
And then the family separation policy, it was just awful. Seeing those images of children being taken away from their parents at the border, being kept in overcrowded places that were often really unsanitary, it was heartbreaking.
It was truly a dark time, and we're still trying to understand the lasting psychological effects it had on those children and families. But beyond that immediate human cost, those policies marked a real change in how the U.S. approached immigration. It became about keeping people out, even if it meant breaking up families.
You mentioned the asylum system. How did all of this affect people like Keldy who were just trying to get help through that system?
It made things so much harder. For people like Kelly, who risked everything to come to the U.S. hoping for safety and a new life, the policies the Trump administration put in place just created more hurdles. One of the biggest was using Title 42, which is actually a health law that was used during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, I remember that. Didn't they say they had to use it to stop the virus from spreading?
That's what they said. But a lot of people thought Title 42 was really being used as an excuse to basically shut down the asylum system at the border. It allowed the U.S. to send migrants back, even people who were looking for asylum, without giving them a chance to explain their situation or get help from a lawyer.
So instead of honoring the right to seek asylum, which is a fundamental part of international law, the focus became preventing people from even stepping foot in the U.S. to ask for help.
Exactly. And the consequences for people and families who were fleeing danger and looking for a safe place were devastating.
It really shows you how quickly things can change and how much power one administration has to affect the lives of so many. It feels like we've moved even further away from that myth of the border idea. We're not acknowledging the connections, the shared responsibility. It's more about building walls, both literally and figuratively.
That's a really good point. And it's in the middle of all of this complexity and, frankly, discouragement that we come across a twist in the story. Do you remember General Vides Casanova? He was that Salvadoran military officer who is accused of being involved in torturing and killing people during the Civil War in El Salvador, the same one that Juan Romagosa faced.
Yes. He was granted asylum in the U.S., right?
He was. But then, in a surprising turn of events, he was deported from the U.S. in 2015.
Wow. Your king,
Yes.
after all those years, what happened?
His past caught up with him. Human rights groups have been working really hard to get him deported. They presented evidence of his involvement in war crimes. And eventually, a U.S. immigration court decided that he had hidden his past and shouldn't have been given asylum.
So even though it took a long time, people didn't give up on trying to hold him accountable.
Exactly. It shows that even when things seem impossible, even when it takes years, the fight for justice can make a difference.
It does give you some hope knowing that people who commit human rights abuses might be able to avoid consequences for a while, but they can still be held responsible in the end. But what about everyone else whose lives have been so affected by this complicated history? What happens to Juan Eddie Keldy and all the others?
That's the big question, isn't it? The Biden administration has gotten rid of some of the Trump-era policies, but the core issues are still there. The asylum system needs to be fixed. Central America is still dealing with violence, poverty, and the effects of climate change. All of these things contribute to people leaving their homes. It's a cycle that never seems to end.
We keep coming back to this idea of interconnectedness. The problems in Central America, they don't stay within those borders. They affect the U.S., and U.S. policies affect the region. It's this endless loop.
It's a really complicated situation, and there's no easy answer. But we have to keep talking about it. We have to educate ourselves about how we got here, and we have to think about the human cost of these policies. This book, Everyone Who's Gone Is Here, is a powerful reminder that these aren't just political issues. They're about real people with real lives and real hopes and dreams.
It's about remembering that we're all connected no matter where we're from or what's written in our passports. We've spent this time together taking a deep dive into the history of U.S. involvement in Central America, how immigration policies have changed over time, and the impact these forces have had on individuals. We've seen how decisions made in Washington, D.C. can have a ripple effect that's felt across borders and across generations.
And that idea of the myth of the border has been our guide. It's helped us to look beyond the lines on the map and understand that these issues are all connected. We don't exist in isolation. Our lives are woven together. Our fates are woven together. As we move forward, it's so important for us to remember the stories of Juan Eddie Keldy and countless others. Their strength, their struggles, their successes, they should inspire us to do better.
They challenge us to be more empathetic, more understanding, and more committed to creating a world that's more just and compassionate for everyone. We hope this deep dive has made you curious, challenged some of your assumptions, and inspired you to learn more about these really important issues. Thanks for coming on this journey with us.